The Burrows of Berea is a conversational podcast. We study the Bible and we talk about it.
Not all of us are of the same faith, and one of us doesn't actually have a faith.
And that's wonderful. We all love one another, and we're going to continue to talk about these things.
The things we believe in and the things we believe about what we read in the Bible. Not all of these are necessarily true. Some of it is opinion and speculation. Thank you for
listening and speculating with us.
There you go. That was good. Yes.
You are listening to the Burrows of Berea.
Folks, welcome back to Notes from the Underground, where we're going to take a microscope to some of Christianity's thornier topics and people. I'm your host, Tiziana Mom So Hard Severse.
How do you mom so hard today?
You know what? I love you. Have a good day.
Oh,
you know,
how motherly.
I do. Well, we just had Mother's Day, so I'm feeling particularly warm.
Oh,
my daughter.
You had a good Mother's Day.
Well, yeah, I did. I had a good Mother's Day. My daughter made me a Mother's Day card. She's 2.5, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So her Mother's Day card was a piece of white paper with a pink rectangle glued in the middle of it.
Beautiful.
And some scribble scratch.
I still have some of that for my kids.
But like the way she ran to the door at daycare, Mama, I made you a Mother's Day card because I love you.
That's
and
the
gave
gift.
it to me.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my, like, I got sentimental when my husband asked me to marry him, but like that took a second. Like that's number 2 now.
Yeah.
You know, like that is number 2 now. But yeah. To my right, Rick, the Podfather Welch.
Hello.
What does Holly call you?
She calls me the Podfather.
She's the Podfather.
She says I'm the Podfather. And
I like that
I'm
one.
going to make a podcast that you can't refute.
Yeah, refute. That's it. That's my favorite. I like that.
Yeah.
And then behind the glass, Rocket Man and the Bishop. We're slim pickings today.
We are.
We're missing the Rickoning and we're missing Sarita
he's not the Rickoning anymore.
Oh, no?
No, you gave him a new name.
Oh, yeah.
You know what he is?
Is it Daddy?
He's Big Daddy Carter.
Daddy Carter. Yeah.
and it fits.
Funny.
It's funny. We love it.
Funny.
Yeah.
I hope we haven't gotten a whole lot of flack for that.
For what?
For that podcast that we did where we're making jokes about.
No.
Okay, good.
No, I mean, the only, to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of the feedback I've been getting recently has been overwhelmingly positive.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And remember, I did cut out the part where we all admitted to our violent crimes.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Okay, good.
So
good,
I think
good.
that probably helped it go over.
All the
Yeah.
culpability for our previous
Yeah.
sins. Yeah, okay, that's good.
But I am holding it in case you guys want to get lippy.
We have a lot of, exactly. He has, the first time I ever made our intro, I said, and I was like, it's a conversational podcast. We study the Bible. We talk about it.
Yeah.
Not all of us are in the same faith.
And one of us doesn't even have a faith. Yeah.
And that's wonderful. We all love one another. We're going to continue to talk about these things.
Yeah.
The things we believe in and things we believe about what we read in the Bible.
Yeah.
Not all of these things are necessarily true.
Some of this is speculation.
Opinion and speculation. Thank you for listening and speculating with us. And if you don't like it, you can go yourself. And he took it out. But he still has it.
I'm sure it's somewhere. Yes.
Lippy. Do not get lippy.
Don't get lippy with
I was
Andy.
actually just kidding. I didn't mean it that
track of all our
way.
sins.
No.
But I said it as a shock to Billy because Billy's eyes got as big as 50-cent pieces. And he's like, what?
That's awesome.
Yeah,
That is amazing.
Yes.
I'm giving a thumbs up to the babysitter because I want to know that everything's okay.
Yeah.
That's how I mom so hard today. I've got the infant.
She's going through her bag or something. I promise, if something goes wrong, you're going to be the first
to
she
know.
tells.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Cool.
You absolutely will be.
Well, y'all, we've been doing a deep dive in preparation for and now in honor of Pride Month, which is where we spend some time as a nation celebrating and affirming the LGBTQAI community. And so because of that, as a national situation, we've decided to do a deep dive on same-sex relations and the Bible. This is our 3rd installment today. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to the previous 2 installments, you might want to go ahead and do that so that you're on the same page with us. As usual, this is a giant conversation with an absolutely astronomical amount of cultural research and relevance and historical information that needs to be kind of sorted through before we can understand what we're talking about. So if you are jumping into this podcast now, you might be a little bit lost.
Yeah, and
if you don't go back to the beginning.
The people that I encounter on a daily basis, would even have a problem with you saying in honor of or anything. Like it's so hardcore their stance against this topic that I feel like we've forgotten how to love people in that regard, and to understand that these are human beings, that they have what they believe and they do what they do, and that to alienate them and to put them on the side and treat them as if they're subhuman, in my opinion, is barbaric and awful. And we are way beyond that.
Yeah.
And
One
so
would hope.
Yeah. But we do understand that as we approach the Bible, that certain people that believe specific ways, that we're getting in deep, we're having the conversation that a lot of them will not even have.
Yeah.
And they may, and I'll just tell you now, if you are, angry about it or whatever, you may not be happy with how we're going with this episode, and that's okay. You just have to turn it off. We're going to do our thing.
We're going to do our thing, but also if you...
Or don't turn it off. Do your best to listen through and, I don't know, use it to devise your arguments against the things that have been said.
And I agree with that 100%. I guess I
know?
just mean there are some people that are very harsh.
That's
man.
true.
They
If
say
it's
some very hard
triggering
things.
and
It's triggering.
If it's triggering and it turns you into a person that is unable to be reasonable and it's completely crushing your day, if you get triggered by this sort of thing, then I guess that's all you can do is just avoid it.
Yeah.
Well, let me just also say there is some amount of what we are going to be discussing, what we're going to be diving into in terms of what the Greco-Roman culture was like and what practices were commonplace and what practices had social sanction that are fucking gross. And in reality, if you are living today and you have a preconceived notion about what the gay community is or is not based on those cultural practices, you wouldn't be remiss for having a violent attitude towards the LGBTQIA community. But
To be clear, because a lot of those practices
were gross,
horrible.
and were abhorrent, and we're going to discuss that.
Right.
What I'm suggesting is that we need to update our definitions of certain things because "quote unquote" homosexual isn't that anymore. That is a different thing.
Yeah,
And-
that word, like you talked about in the very first
Right.
episode, it's
a
not
different
even.
thing.
Yeah, I
It's a
understand.
completely different thing. And so what I want to do and what I'm hoping to do is give us permission to unequivocally denounce the things that God also unequivocally denounces, but also give ourselves some theological freedom to not just condemn a whole swath of people because of a couple of practices that God's not into. Here's the thing. What does the Bible say about pornography? Nothing. You know why? Because pornography is an invention of the modern age. Now, there were cave paintings. We've uncovered a lot of stuff, like in Rome because of like Pompeii and Mount Vesuvius, we had these giant eruptions that preserved whole towns and cities because everybody was just laid waste in the ash and lava immediately. So as they've dug and found some archaeological stuff, we do have quote unquote images, pornea. We do have these images on like cave walls, on like city walls, are essentially graffiti. We have vases. Vases were commissioned art in the Greco-Roman world. So you didn't go to a shop and just like buy one. You like would commission them and they would get painted at your request. So we have vases that are painted depicting behaviors that the owner of that vase requested to be painted on that vase. Okay?
I did not know that. I'd never heard that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
I did so much research.
It's a lot. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to do that today, it'd be really, really expensive.
It would. And it was at the time too.
Sure.
The vases that we like when we have that art, that is like the rich people had that. Rich people had that. When we talk about the ancient world, we're talking about the upper echelon because those are the people that had the finances to go to school, who had the opportunity to spend time writing about it. So it's basically as if 500 years from now, you are trying to understand all of American culture by watching 4 episodes of The Real Housewives.
Yeah.
That's what it's like. Now, there are going to be certain things within that series of shows that you are going to be able to apply to all of American culture, but you also have to recognize there is a certain issue of class that is happening here.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we get to the part of this study where we're going to be discussing New Testament culture and New Testament literature and New Testament condemnations of behavior, we're going to be acknowledging that the culture that these people were discussing and talking about, because what you're talking about is Christians that are going, okay, we don't want to live like the people around us anymore. So how are they living? Most of what we have now to look back and go, well, what was that culture, is what the upper echelon of society were doing. We have these vases. They're disgusting. They're disgusting.
Yeah.
Like, why would you want to display that? You know what was really popular in Rome? Tiny little dicks on necklaces. Why?
Were they all
Why?
having bachelorette parties?
Dude, no, they were for men. Like, it's so wild.
Yeah.
The culture in and around ancient Greece and Rome had such a very different approach to like sexuality and like what was acceptable and stuff. So when we get to that portion, you also have to remember what we have left that we can examine: the poetry, the literature, the legal documentation. I have a giant book right here in front of me that contains all the source documents, the actual documents that we have that these extrapolations were made from.
Amazing.
I'm so sorry.
That's so cool.
I'm like thinking of a Quantum Leap episode where they go back to Rome and all these guys have these tiny little dicks on their skin.
It's wild. It's so wild.
They won't do
great.
it. They won't
It's
do it,
so
but it would have
wild.
been hilarious.
And it's so wild. And like when we get there, there's this one particular play called Clouds that's really interesting. And it's a young man, and it's a young man, and it's basically like a good angel on the shoulder, bad angel on the shoulder. And they're trying to like convince this guy to follow their tutelage on how to be a man is kind of what this thing's about. It's really short and good argument. The white angel is supposedly, and what it is a giant commentary on the culture. And so they're both actually terrible arguments. Like they're both the bad angel, but the white angel is kind of how society has tried to make a terrible living seem good. And that's what the story's about, right? That's the play.
Yeah.
And Good Argument is telling this guy, if you do things my way, you're going to have, now this is not, I'm quoting directly, you're going to have a blossoming physique, a well-rounded rump, and a tiny prick.
Yeah.
Because that was what was gorgeous. That was what was considered the epitome, a big, giant, feminine butt and a tiny little wiener.
What?
Dude, like
That's funny.
it's so interesting. But listen,
Sounds like what Michelangelo made with David.
that's exactly.
I've heard that about
Yeah.
a lot of that statuary, that the penises are appropriately sized for what was considered to be attractive at the time.
Yeah, and there's other periods of time in Greek culture where that shifted, right? It's different depending on like. We are so off topic right now.
Sorry.
Because the next stop in the sexy train is Leviticus, not Romans.
Yeah.
So we need to like rewind, like, you know.
Well, we've talked about statue
back to the beginning.
penises. I think we're good here.
Yeah. Talked about tiny weens as a form of personal decoration.
Oh, man.
So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to concentrate our study from Genesis to Revelation. So our first podcast was sort of setting the stage about what we believe about the Bible and, you know, making sure that anybody who would jump to a conclusion about my opinion and belief about the Bible and its authorship and its validity would be able to know for sure that I profess Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. I believe the Bible's God-breathed, right?
Yeah.
Don't come at me with that ish. I don't want to hear it. Number one. Number two, we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah because that is the first time in the Hebrew Bible where we encounter this sort of like same-sex relations and their eventual fallout. We've debunked the idea that story is about homosexuality. It's not. Go listen to that podcast if you are not following. The next place that we're going to have a discussion is Leviticus. Because Leviticus 18:22 is where we find the prohibition: if a man lies with a man, as a man lies with a woman, he's done what is an abomination, put them both to death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, starting from the top of the book of Leviticus, its etymology. Most of the time, people assume that the book of Leviticus is about the Levites. It's not. Leviticus is a English translation of the Latin form of the Septuagint's title for the book, which was Leviticron. So Leviticron means priests or priestly.
Also my favorite Transformer.
Leviticron.
It's the only Transformer with a beard.
Nice. And a tiny wiener. Nice. So the original name...
That tag was too good.
It was.
The original name for the Hebrew book was Vakira. In the original Hebrew, each of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy, the name of those books refers to the first word or words of the book. And so Vakira literally means he called, because the first words in Leviticus are, and the Lord called to Moshe, saying, right? We say Moses.
Must have
I
been
add
a lot of
something?
books called The.
First of all, you taught me this, so I didn't know.
Oh.
But I learned something after I looked it up.
Okay.
I was like, oh, this is so awesome. I had no idea because I always thought it was just about the Levites, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't. And I was like, oh, wow. Well,
No.
I'm glad I learned that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also learned that like the Psalms, you know how we like, let's recite the 23rd Psalm. We'll say that. Well, that's not how the Hebrews looked at it. You know what they titled them? It's the first words in the book.
Yeah.
So the Lord is my shepherd was the name of the psalm.
Yeah.
And we do hymns that way too, like Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine.
Right,
It
right,
starts
right,
off with
right,
the
right,
first
right,
word.
right. Yeah.
Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound.
Right,
Amazing
right,
Grace,
right.
right?
Funny.
It's the front of the hymn.
And that's just how they titled things.
That's how they titled it. And they didn't have the number
Oops, I
system
did it
setting.
again.
Oops, I
No,
did
I'm
it
just
again. Britney Spears. But if you
well,
did
tradition.
Just kidding.
I mean, that
But-
was obviously an intentional reference to Old Hebrew.
but it also
Yeah.
Slow burn.
I wonder what yeah. So
I was just like,
yeah, okay.
That took me
That's how I
such
feel.
a long time.
Just so you know, that's how I feel when you and Andy talk most of the time. So, especially on the modern English language. But the thing that I learned that I thought was so awesome, I'm sorry to take you off topic, but
No,
it is on
good.
topic.
No, it is.
When Jesus was on the cross and he was dying, he says, my God,
Yeah.
why hast thou forsaken me? And we know that that's how the 22nd Psalm starts. Well, think about it. If it's the title of the Psalm, he's actually saying the title of the Psalm. And it's a messianic psalm about his suffering and his death. And in essence, what he's doing in front of everyone there at the cross is he's saying, think about that psalm.
Oh,
A lot of
interesting.
people think that it's like, oh, he's actually being forsaken. And
Oh.
we hear the theology, but there's another way of looking at it.
But he's referencing, you think he's referencing that psalm.
It
He is
sounds like
referencing the
he's
psalm. I think he's referencing
He's
the psalm.
absolutely referencing the
Yeah.
psalm, but he's also the mind of the people. They're saying,
They would have caught that
we
right
just
away.
killed the Messiah.
Yeah.
That's what it's
They would have
about.
just caught it. Yeah.
It's incredible.
It's also possible that he was in true distress and he was praying.
And it's also
You
possible
know, and
that
he was
Absolutely.
praying a familiar prayer, you know,
Yeah.
and one that would have brought him great comfort in that moment, an hour of his death.
Sure. And
You know,
but anyway, sorry to sidetrack you on
no,
that. But
you're
you
just
taught
not
me something,
sidetracked.
and I
It's
was like,
totally
guess what I learned?
interesting. Yeah, it's so fascinating. So that's what we're gonna be looking at. We're looking at the book of Leviticus. It's instructions for the priest, and it comes from Vakira, which means he called. That's where that comes from. It's the first statement of the book, right? The placement of Leviticus is right there in the middle between Exodus and Numbers. So Exodus is not just about Israel's deliverance from Egypt. That's what we've come to know it as based on like the Prince of Egypt and stuff. That's really only like the first like 3 or 4 chapters of the book, or like the first 8 maybe. And there's like 40 chapters of the book. So it's just the beginnings, the rest of that book, right? Once they get out, it's the beginnings of the structure of Israel as a people out of slavery. And it includes issues of culture and justice. In Exodus 18, that's when Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, sees that people are individually coming to Moses every single day and asking him to arbitrate their issues.
Yeah, be a judge for us.
Yeah, and Jethro's like, dude, this is not like sustainable, man. Like you got too much to do. Like you can't do that. And so 18:14, Moses is like, well, they come to me to inquire of God, and I need to decide between one person and the other, like what's the right thing to do. So why don't we real quickly I'm going to read the rest of that chapter.
Okay, sure.
Because when we understand what's coming from where and why, right? So let's read, we're going to read Exodus 18. So Jethro's like, this is like such a waste of your time. Like, what are you doing? And then Moses is like, but they come to me because like, I have to do this thing,
with
you know?
God, yeah.
So you will surely wail yourself out, is what Moses' father-in-law told him. What you're doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me, and I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases before God. Teach them the statutes and instructions, and make known to them the way they are to go and the things they are to do. You should also look for able men among all the people, men who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Set such men over them as officers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Local police, state troopers, the army,
Feds.
the president, the feds,
Yep.
the president. Like, he's like, look, this is,
Right.
look, make community officers, make statewide officers, make national officers, and then you're in charge, right? If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their homes in peace. So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he said. Moses chose able men from all Israel and appointed them as heads over the people, as officers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And they judged the people at all times. Hard cases they brought to Moses, but any minor case they decided themselves. Then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went off to his own country. And that's the rest of chapter 18. So they're wandering around in the desert. They're trying to figure out how to establish a social order.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to figure out how to establish a code of conduct and the laying of the like sort of spiritual and social foundations of Israel's covenant with this God, who they didn't know. Let's be clear. Israel didn't really know their God anymore because they'd been removed from him for so long in their slavery. If you look way back at the beginning of Exodus, they were crying out because of their oppression. And it says God remembered his people.
Yeah.
Which suggests he kind of forgot about him.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And it certainly seems that way. I mean, he was definitely, he had told Abraham what would happen to the people, that it would be for 400 years, and that's exactly what happened. And so when they cry out to him in that point, he wasn't listening prior to that.
No. So there's this interesting period of time where these people, they like kind of have like a vague like memory of this God that was their God before they came into this time of enslavement. But like they didn't have synagogues, they didn't have people teaching. They were really pretty much wrapped in and around Egyptian culture and in their identity as slaves.
Mm-hmm. And I think they probably had bits and pieces of their culture that were still, inside their little homes. They might do things that were similar to their culture, but they were definitely away from what they'd known. And so they were fully cross-pollinated with what they were in for 400 years.
So you want to go back to Egypt?
Yeah.
Where it's warm and secure. Little Keith Green for you.
Eating leeks and onions by the Nile. Ooh, what breath. We're dining out in style.
Oh, yeah.
I love that song.
We should have a whole episode where we just like
Keith
sing
Green.
our favorite Keith Green songs. But so the rest of Exodus, they leave. They have all these miracles, the striking of the water, the manna falling, the quails, whatnot. And also, it's sprinkled here and there with this construction of a social and ethical order that Moses is, as the head, giving to these people, these men in charge of thousands, tens, hundreds, tens, fifties, and tens. Mm-hmm. So this goes, from chapter 18 to chapter 40, these bits and pieces of the foundation are sort of like interspersed. And then there's the structure of the tabernacle, the 10 commandments, all of that's happening at the same time. And then in chapter 20, chapter 20 is where the 10 commandments come into play. So all of that stuff that we think of as, their time in the wilderness, the narrative begins with their leaving Egypt. There's a
Right.
whole lot more. All right. So then the tabernacle is constructed at the very end. Chapter 40, it's like the last thing. And the Lord gives instruction on when and how to set up the tabernacle. And then in verse 16 of 18 of Exodus 40, Moses did everything just as the Lord had commanded him. In the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was set up. So it's the first month of their second year of exile. So they've only been outside of Egypt for 2 years.
Right. Yeah,
They're just figuring it out.
that's right.
And that's when Moses sets up the tabernacle. Leviticus 1:1 then says, the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Leviticus 9 says, on the 8th day, Moses summoned Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. So on the first month of the second year of the first day, he sets it up. Then the Lord speaks to Moses. On the 8th day, he summons Aaron and his elders, right? Like there's this timeline. And then Numbers 1:1 and 2 says, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt. So essentially, the book of Leviticus, the whole book, that takes place in the first month of the second year of their Exodus. Because Numbers then starts in the second month of the second year.
Okay.
So it's just the tabernacle's finally established. You know, we've already had the 10 commandments. We've already had, you know, bits and pieces of their culture set up. But like now, God's like, now that there's a tabernacle, God's like, okay, let's just get all of this out and like written down so that you guys can start being accountable to this covenant. So the date of the Exodus has never really been fully determined with like any kind of certainty, but a lot of scholars kind of pretty much agree that this happened during Egypt's New Kingdom, which was like 1550 to 1069 BCE. And just a note, I use BCE and CE because that is what current scholarship uses before the Common Era and the Common Era. So the book of Leviticus is likely dated to around that same time. And that's a big jump. That's like a 500-year
Yeah.
somewhere between 1550 and 1069 BCE. That's a big chunk of time, but that's about where this is all going on. All right. The structure of the book is pretty straightforward. Chapters 1 through 7 are this new sacrificial system, the burnt offerings, grain offerings, guilt offerings, all that stuff. Then chapters 8 through 10 are like the inauguration of the priests and the sacrificial service. Chapters 11 through 16 are the purifications and impurity systems. So this is like after a woman had childbirth, she's unclean for X amount of time. If a man has an emission in the night, he must go immerse himself fully in water. He's unclean till evening. Just all of that stuff. If there's a piece of fabric with a fungus on it, the piece of that fabric has to get cut out and the rest of the garment has to be immersed in water. Like that's all that stuff. And then chapters 17 through 27 are the holiness code. And this is where God outlines the obligations and prohibitions that Israel must follow in order to fulfill God's commands and become a holy people. Holy meaning set apart from other people. I was reading Pamela Eisenbaum this morning, and she was discussing how it's important to note there wasn't necessarily anything inherently wrong with semen, for example. It's just that, because like if you had slept with your wife, you were unclean until evening, so you couldn't go to tabernacle. Like you had to fully immerse yourself in water. That was the requirement every time you had sex.
That's weird.
And so what Pamela Eisenbaum is a scholar and an author, and she's actually a New Testament scholar, but she's Jewish. And she was one of my professors, and I love her dearly. But she was saying that like it's not as if there was something inherently evil about semen or like heterosexual sex between a loving couple. It's just that God is outlining the ways that Israel is supposed to behave radically different than its neighbors. It's supposed to be radically different than its neighbors for a reason, you know? Because this is how this nation is meant to define itself as unique from its cultural neighbors.
Yeah,
right?
and it seems like their God is defining what the holiness actually is.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
to them.
Yeah, to them. And,
Yeah.
and again, like it's not like there's nothing inherently evil or wrong about a woman menstruating. She also, when she's menstruating, is not allowed to go to tabernacle. Like there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's just that because of the cultural practices of their neighbors, which often included, you all right, Andy?
My leg itched.
Okay. Andy was doing yoga in there for a second. But because of the cultural practices of their neighbors, this is also meant to describe and define the differences between what is holiness to this tabernacle versus holiness to other tabernacles. Because, hey, surprise, Israel's not the only one that had a tent of meeting.
Right.
Lots of cultures, especially ones that were nomadic and lived in the desert, had a tabernacle that was a tent of meeting that could get moved and set up somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, newsflash, they didn't make up animal sacrifice.
No.
Literally every single neighboring nation had a system of animal sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
None of this was invented by Israel's God. None of it.
Mm-hmm.
These were the cultural practices that were happening in and around Israel. It's just that, so this is the way that God's like, okay. I'm going to take you where you are and create a system that looks similar to you, so that looks familiar, that you know,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm going to tell you how you do it differently because I am different than all those other gods.
Right.
So here's a tabernacle. You guys know what that looks like. You're familiar with that. Here's a burnt offering system. You're familiar with that. You know that. But here's how we're going to do it differently. Mm-hmm. That's what that's all about. So chapters 17 through 27 are the holiness code. And this is where God outlines kind of those prohibitions and obligations. And I think I got this giant book, The Koran Tanakh of Israel. It's amazing. It's a great series. And I read a lot of really interesting stuff that I'd like to share. One thing that's of particular note is the fact that all of these things, what is holy, what is ethical, and what is practical, are all wrapped up into one text. That's extremely unique in terms of ancient writings that we have from other cultures in the Levant. Torah is literally the only text where we see that happen. Every other culture and every other writings that we have, they are segregated. What is priestly is the business of the priests, and what is civic is, the business of the civic leaders. Mm-hmm. And never the twain shall meet. What's also significant about the division is that what was priestly in other cultures was meant to be secret. It was meant to be private, and it was not to be disseminated to the rabble.
Yeah,
Right.
I still feel that in a lot of religion, which I always thought was odd.
Yeah.
It's not like they're doing anything all that special, frankly.
Well, everybody has seen The Prince of Egypt. No.
I did not.
Oh, brother, I own it. Let's have a date.
Is it the new one?
I watched
The old one, the DreamWorks one.
Oh,
Yeah.
With Val Kilmer and Michelle Pfeiffer and Steve Martin. And
It's animated.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
it's the
cartoon.
one that came out at the same time as what movie was it? That
there can be miracles when you believe. That song still gets
They
me.
see the separation of the Red Sea, and then you see a whale in there. It's
Oh,
neat.
hope is frail. Yeah, and it's this incredible, right? That was like, I remember they kept that in the previews because it was just animation wise and what was this, 92 or some nonsense. That was just mind blowing. It was the best animation anyone had ever seen.
It was really good.
But there's this scene where Moses, voiced by Val Kilmer, is going to stand in front of Pharaoh and demand his people go. And he's got these neat little tricks that God taught him to make his staff turn into a serpent, or pull his hand out and it's covered in leprosy. God gave him these little tricks. And the Egyptian priests are like, you're cute. Here, we do that.
Yeah.
That ain't nothing, sir.
Yeah.
When you watch that movie, it visually kind of depicts what I'm talking about. This idea that these priests have power.
Yeah.
And they can do things. They mess around. They put food coloring in the water and they're like, it's blood, right? The movie shows you the ways that the priesthood was kept kind of secretive. The rituals were secret. It was supposed to lend credence to what they were doing, the mystery, and it kept the people in fear. Now, this is me being a little ethnocentric. So let's just acknowledge that. That means I'm looking at this culture through the lens of my own, right?
Right, sure.
But because the people had no power, it kept all the power concentrated in the hands of the priests. Mm-hmm. And because all of the stuff was secret, the people didn't really know, you had to go seek out the will of God from, the soothsayers and the witches. You had no ability to figure out what was right or wrong for your life. You had to go to the priests. And I got a couple really
secret knowledge.
Yeah, and I got some really interesting stuff. So we have this Akkadian text. So the Akkadians are the first empire of Mesopotamia. Genesis 10 mentions Nimrod, and many of us believe that this was the Sargon who was king of Akkad, the Akkadian Empire. Anyway, so old.
Right.
Their temple program for New Year's festivals at Babylon includes a colophon, which is like a thing at the end, a tagline at the end. The secrets of the temple of Isagil will be shown to nobody except the priest of the temple Ikua. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead also includes several similar colophons at the end of the individual spells. So spell 144 states, "You shall recite this spell without letting anyone see it." And spell 190 opens with, "This roll is a very real secret. The rabble of all people must never see it."
The rabble.
The rabble.
I think I've come to the conclusion that the reason they had to keep all that secret is because at the end of the day, it was really nothing special.
I think so. But I mean, whatever. That's me like being super judgy.
Right. But that's
like,
the power comes from
them other guys didn't have no power. Them other guys ain't shit. You know, like
yeah, the power comes
it,
from the secrecy.
You feel it today.
Yeah,
you feel it today. Even in
Yeah.
our modern society, when you think about what does the CIA know, they're on the in.
Right.
They know all of the secrets. So the big brother is watching you, and then when we have something happen, we're like, how did that happen? Didn't they all know? Do you know what I mean? Like you suddenly realize we don't know as much as we think we do.
Yeah, larger lesson. Whatever you think is crazy and secret and exciting is probably mundane.
Yeah.
Well, and this
like
is,
always mundane.
This is why Martin Luther was such a powerhouse. That's why his translating the Bible into German was such a like massive upset, because at that point, it was only in Latin. And if you couldn't read Latin, you were dependent on the priests. And this is Christianity now, so I'm holding you accountable too, modern Christians, or the culture of historical Christianity, Catholicism. There was a period of time where like the secrets of the Bible were meant to be kept from the everyday average person, because you weren't able to read it and figure it out for yourself. You had to be taught, because you're an idiot.
Isn't that why they call it the Dark Ages?
Well, yeah.
Is that part of it?
I think
They
that's
were
part of
keeping
it.
the enlightened part of
Yeah.
I don't know. I could be wrong.
No, I think that is part of it. I think there's different scholarship around the Dark Ages now. They try not to call it that because I think it's like sounds mean or something.
Oh, okay.
I think they call them just the Middle Ages now or whatever.
I just thought it was like absence of
but I think it
enlightenment,
has to do with that too, because people couldn't read.
They
people
weren't able to read,
and and that was partly how the church kept control of everybody.
Sure.
Which is exactly what the book of Leviticus is trying not to do. Because once again, so many times in Leviticus, the Lord's command is to speak to the people. Moses' job is to receive the revelation and then disseminate it to all people. This is unbelievably unique.
Yeah, no secrets here.
Only exists in Torah in terms of every other ancient text we've ever uncovered.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's really amazing. Like it's meant, and only here do we see what is ethical and what is holy being combined into one.
Yeah.
Because Israel's
That's
treatment
fascinating.
of one another was not just because this is civic law. It was because this is how you honor your deity. Totally unique.
Yeah.
Like that's not a thing in any other culture. What's priestly is priestly, what's civic is civic, and never the twain shall meet. In Torah, it's completely different. Their entire culture and the way that you treat one another is also holy, which is, again, all the way back to Genesis. That's one of the biggest indictments that all the prophets had on Sodom and Gomorrah, because the way they were treating each other, the way they were treating each other was mean and greedy and selfish. I mean, I believe Ezekiel outlines, and we went over that in the last episode, exactly what the sins of Sodom were, and not a single one of them was sexual. It was they were greedy, they had abundance, and they didn't share. They were vain, right?
Yeah.
You don't treat, in this culture, in the Israelite culture, the way that this is the foundations of this culture are being laid, you don't treat each other that way. You don't treat each other that way. And so it's really interesting and unique. So again, chapters 1 through 7 are the sacrificial system, which we've already discussed that was not created in a vacuum. We found this thing called the Marseille Tariff, which is also really interesting. The Marseille Tariff is from like the 3rd or 4th century, and it's a stone monument that's written in the Punic language. So Punic was linguistically really, really similar to Hebrew, and it's like a Semitic language. And so this is 3rd or 4th century BCE, and it's also like a list of animals, what they cost, how the priest is to cut them up, which parts are supposed to be burned, sacrificed, and what not. And it comes with the same sort of like linguistic structure as Leviticus, which all does this if-when thing. So if you bring a goat, when you do this, it's really similar. So I just want to point out again that like the sacrificial system outlined in 1 through 7, that's not really that's not that unique. Everybody was doing that. But what I think what's happening here is that what we're seeing is the setup of the ultimate goal of this God, which is different from the ultimate goal of all the other gods that were utilizing a sacrificial system. Because what we know was the ultimate goal of God was to do away with the sacrificial system entirely. So I have a bunch of different verses I'm going to just rapid fire read. Hosea 6:6, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Psalm 51:16 through 17, for you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken heart, a broken and contrite spirit. God will not despise. I read that backwards, broken spirit. Isaiah 1, verse 11 and following, right? So I mingled it up. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me, and I am weary of bearing them. So God goes on in Isaiah to say in verse 16, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil from your deeds before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's case. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. So what has begun in Leviticus and continues throughout the monarchy, throughout the exile, is the story of God not removing Israel from Egypt, but removing Egypt from Israel.
Yes. I'm going to give you an amen on that one. That is exactly right.
It's the story of him removing 400 years, right, of messed up, mixed up ideas about who God is and how God wants to be worshiped. So he's giving them a system that's familiar, i.e. sacrifice, making a bunch of like weird changes so that they can start to see and understand what God does and does not want from them.
You just made me think of another Keith Green song.
Oh.
To obey is better than sacrifice. I don't want your money, I want your life. Oh, there you got one to listen to tonight.
What?
That's Keith Green.
I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, I love it.
That's wild. I didn't know there was a song I've never heard. I didn't know there was one I hadn't heard. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
Poor Heather, because my friend Heather is babysitting. She's hanging out. I don't know if she's listening or not, but she's going to have to listen to that on the way home, whether she likes it or not.
It's a beautiful song.
Is she in here? Okay.
Yeah, she's sitting back there, but she doesn't have her headphones on.
Oh, she doesn't? Oh, she's like, I don't give a shit about it. None of this matters to me. I'm just kidding. She actually went to seminary too. She's got a degree in Bible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. She's really cool. She's my neighbor. Our kids go to school together.
Oh, very cool.
They don't go. Her daughter's in a different class.
Yeah.
But both our kids have developmental day vouchers. So that maybe we can shout out to the Patreons now.
Yeah.
That might be a good idea.
Yeah.
We want to thank all of the Patreon supporters that have provided financially for us because it made it possible for me to be here today because Heather is able to watch the baby for some money.
Yeah.
Her daughter has cerebral palsy and she's a single mom. So
your money went to a very great place today.
Yeah.
And we get to talk about
she
this.
She lost her husband last October.
Oh my gosh.
And so, So thank you, Patreon supporters, for letting Heather have a job today.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Anyway, back to what we were talking about. So 400 years they were in slavery. 400 years they watched this is how you worship with the sacrifices and this and that. So God sets this thing up that God eventually wants to destroy because he's going to just meet Israel where they are and meet them with a system that's familiar to them. But ultimately God had no desire, like we just read in several verses. I don't really care about this. This doesn't really matter to me. What I really want is for you to be obedient. What I really want is for you to love justice, what did he say? Let's read it again. What makes God really happy? Seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause.
Yeah.
That's what the goal was.
That's where he's headed.
God never gave two craps about how many turtle doves you got to sacrifice after your firstborn. It's just he set up that system because he needed Israel to start the process of learning your sins cost something.
Yes. That's it.
Your holiness to me costs you something.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the cost, right? So that's what's going on.
That's a fantastic setup. Good
It
job.
was never the point. Sacrifice was never the point. Which also, of course, so not only do we hear from the prophets that wasn't the point through Isaiah and Israel we just read, then Jesus comes on the scene and he's like, guess what? I was the whole point,
Yep.
and now watch me do this.
Yeah.
And then
Hey, y'all, look at this.
even further drive it home, the temple was completely laid waste in 70 AD. So now there's not even any opportunity to exercise the sacrificial system. Because the blood of bulls and lambs and the burnt offerings was never going to be the ultimate end-all be-all goal. The ultimate end-all be-all goal.
It was a type and shadow of what would happen to the Son of God.
Right.
Ultimately.
Yeah. So we can understand the overall point of the system of law when we see just how upset God gets when Israel becomes sidetracked and starts doing things their own way or things the way that their neighbors do. That's why they're not to intermarry. That's why there's the prohibition. Not because there's something inherently evil or ungodly about their neighbors, which is why Ruth, the whole book of Ruth, is about a Moabite being accepted into the fold.
Yeah.
Because it was never just about these people are bad. It was I really need you to not do what they do.
Right.
It's really super important that you not do what they do. Because my goal is to save them too, don't you understand?
That's right.
I made them too. I love them too. But if you intermarry with them, you're going to muddle up the story that I'm trying to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's good. It's going to take you off track and it's going to let them get in
Yes.
you. And that's his whole purpose, is to get that out of them.
Exactly. So this is actually what the intention is the whole time, to rescue the whole world from a sacrificial system, from a system where priests hold all of the knowledge and people don't have it, from a system where people have to beg and cry out to God. It's an end to a global system of worship that did not include each individual person having the opportunity to just talk to God for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That was God's ultimate goal, not just to destroy that for Israel, but destroy that for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why when we read the book of Leviticus, it is absolutely imperative that we understand some of the prohibitions that show up in the holiness code, because it's not just about what God doesn't want Israel to do. It's actually how God doesn't want Israel to be like their neighbors, culturally or spiritually, which is interesting because the word abomination, toea, has cultural connotations. And I don't have time to get into the whole thing because it's a whole big, huge mess. But there's lots of different times and places where Tovea shows up. One of them is in the story of Joseph when he is making a banquet as he's in charge of people.
When he's in Egypt?
Egyptian court. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's setting up a meal and he's not supposed to do something put some food on the place because that would be a Tovea. That would be an abomination. It's about what's culturally unacceptable.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind because Tovea shows up in Deuteronomy and it's this is an abomination, but it's in reference to this is a Tovea. This is culturally what I don't want y'all to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's used in reference to Israel, but also how certain Israelite practices were a Tovea to other nations.
Yeah. It's like being kosher today.
Yeah, exactly.
Eating kosher.
Exactly.
So if you're going to go to a place, you want to make sure that you can still be strict with your dietary law in the modern time, right?
Yeah.
Same idea.
So keep that in mind. So Torah and the holiness code, it's not just about don't do this. It's about this is what your neighbors are doing, and these are the cultural practices that I don't want you to do. These are the Tovea that I want you to stay away from. So keeping that in mind, let's get into the holiness code, and specifically Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, which is where we find these very two explicit prohibitions against sexual activity between males. So first of all, these verses are embedded in a lot of other verses about who men can and can't have sex with and under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I say men specifically because there are only two laws in this entire holiness code that apply to women, only two. One is about adultery and the other one is bestiality. So there's a lot of like, don't sleep with your sister. Don't sleep with your father's wife. Don't sleep with your sister's best friend. Don't sleep with your, this person. It's like this whole giant list. It's like 13 or 14 specific relations. But there is no counterpart. Don't sleep with your mother's husband. Don't sleep with your brother. Don't sleep with your brother-in-law. There are no counterbalanced laws about what women were supposed to do or could do. So that's the hard reality of what we have to look at. These books are designed to sanction men and their sex drive. They're not about women.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
That's really cool. So in a lot of ways, if this is true, and I believe that it is, much like we talked about in here in the past, we've said to follow the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Would it have been assumed or no that whatever was right for the man was also right for the woman or no?
No, because what God's talking about specifically is power and power dynamics.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Men had power over women. And a lot of those relationships that you see are relationships where men had access. You had access to a sister. Think of Absalom and David's daughter. Tamar. Absalom and Tamar. Women in your home was the women you had access to. And women in your home were also women that didn't have power. And so that's what these laws were about. They were about protecting women and restricting the power of men who had access to widows and sisters and slaves and all this other stuff. And also, they were specifically relations that were common in Egypt. Because it's like, God could have really just said, don't sleep with anyone but your wife. Done.
Yeah.
Don't sleep with anyone but who you're married to. Done. God didn't do that. God outlined these very specific incestuous relationships that we have a lot of evidence were common in Egypt. So incestuous marriages between fathers and daughters and siblings were common in Egypt.
Wow.
Well, look at well here I can prove that just because of Cleopatra. Cleopatra married her younger brother. Did you know that?
Did she? No,
in Egypt,
I know that.
She married her that was the norm, and so she married her younger brother, and then of course there was a lot of issues whenever Julius Caesar comes into town, right? And then they of course, it was a power dynamic. They were trying to get the male to be over the woman because she was very smart and wise and had studied in Alexandria and everything. And so I see that even in that family. I forget the name, the Ptolemies, I think it was. Yeah. And so it was Ptolemy IV that she married initially.
Well, and keep in mind too, like they were Greek. They weren't Egyptian. So because that's going to come up
when
we talk
class
about
of Egypt.
the Ptolemaic era.
Yep. That's right.
So it's important to keep that in mind too, because when we start talking about Greek and that culture and how widespread that influence of that culture was, that's a big deal.
Yeah,
right?
And so by me bringing up Cleopatra, I just fast forwarded like 1,000 years. So we need to go back into the Hebrew world where we were.
But keep in mind that these practices were so embedded in what the ruling class was able to do and what they were doing that 400 years later, they're still doing it.
Right.
And that's important. Like,
it is.
They were still people in power were still doing that. People in power were doing that now. Look at the courts in England. They're always off marrying their first cousins and stuff.
Yeah.
It's about power. It's about concentrating power, and it's about access and vulnerability. Because if you marry your sister, no one else, no other man who's not family can marry her and then challenge you for the throne.
Sure.
So women are treated like pawns. And fathers marrying their daughters, there are certain things that I refuse to chalk up to, well, that's just how they did things.
Right, yeah.
There are some things that I'm willing to chalk up to that. There are certain things that research shows us are inherently devastating to children.
Right.
And incest is top of that motherfucking list.
Yeah.
So God's like, you all have seen certain relationships and you've seen certain behaviors for 400 years. So it's possible that you, now that you're wandering around in the desert trying to figure out how to be in relationship to each other, how to have a society, and how to worship me, it's possible that you might think some of these things are chill. And I'm here to tell you, they are not. they are not chill.
Right.
That is what's going on here. So it's not just about only men are the problem. It's about pointing out these specific power dynamics in these specific relationships that Israel was watching Egypt do.
Mm-hmm. And I want to correct myself. It was
Yeah.
Ptolemy the 14th, not the 4th. My bad. Sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
Well, you know.
I just wanted to correct myself for those people.
I don't know
that say, "You
anything
were
about the
wrong."
Ptolemaic kingdom.
Yeah.
I don't. And so, I mean, yeah, that's a chunk of history
The
that I
who?
really
The Ptolemy.
the Ptolemies,
Ptolemaic.
Ptolemaic
Yeah,
kingdom?
no, it's my joke about
You also don't know anything about it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Andy is also in the Dark Ages over there.
But
Yeah.
Andy, just from your perspective, listening to all this stuff, doesn't it tell you, don't you learn so much? Like, if you don't understand the culture and we just read it in our modern English Bible and they don't spell some of these things out for you, you're going to miss the absolute meaning of what's going on here.
I would never.
We've discovered that. Even in our talk with Dan Frost. Whoops.
Damn.
I was trying to say I was trying to say
Shaking
doctor.
my fist.
Dr. Sam Frost, when
Yeah.
he was here, we kept going back to the languages, the culture,
Yeah.
the languages. If you don't understand it. So you think about hundreds of years or a couple hundred years in American society, only reading the King James Bible and only understanding the English language, how you develop
Yeah,
some
you're
of the
missing a
doctrines
lot
that
of
you do. You
context.
miss a
Yeah.
lot of context. And so what you're doing here is amazing. I'm so glad you're doing it.
Yeah. Well, so that's important. So, like, again, looking back to the structure, the Holiness Code is 17 through 27. That's the chapters. Okay. We've laid this all out. Leviticus 18, 1 through 6. Let's read that. Let's read it.
Let's do it.
Let's read the
Let's do just that.
the actual text.
Yeah, I love it.
I love getting into the actual, like, you have to read the actual thing. So, because 18 is where the dudes don't lie with dudes. So let's read.
Okay.
Leviticus 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes. My ordinances you shall observe, and my statutes you shall keep following them. I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances. By doing so, one shall live. I am the Lord. So none of you shall approach anyone near kin to uncover nakedness. That is when the sexual prohibitions start. A list of 13 relationships. It's the most extensive list we see in any ancient text. There are, we do have some other Mesopotamian and Hittite laws. And we don't have any Canaanite documents, unfortunately. But
Because that's where they were going. It would have been nice to have had those.
It would have been nice to have some. We
but
don't
you're
have
probably
some.
going to learn what they were because of what he's telling them not to do.
But that's exactly the point.
Right.
So he's saying, okay, don't do like they do in Egypt and don't do like they do in Canaan. Don't marry your sisters. Don't marry your brothers. It's not because Israel was doing these things. It's because the people that had enslaved them were.
That's right.
And the land to where they were going were doing those things.
So now you know what both of those places were doing.
And I want to just like take a detour and have a little quick chat because like oftentimes as a woman, when I read these texts and I see the way that God's going out of his way to protect women, I'm just like, that is so friggin' unusual in the history of all religious texts.
Mm-hmm.
That for me as a woman who lives in this body, that in that period of time would have been completely vulnerable. This is one of the reasons why I'm a Christian.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I love that God. That God sounds like an awesome dude.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's
I'm into that. Yeah. And so like primary emotions are the emotions we often feel first. This is a psychological look, right? So you feel things like fear, joy, disgust, surprise, contempt. Secondary emotions are socially learned and they're unique to humans in the animal kingdom and are differently expressed based on our social experience. And they arise when we experience a primary emotion and then express it based on our social experience. So if you live in an individualistic culture like America and you experience and you have a feeling of joy, you may then culturally express it as pride.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Right?
Yep. I can see that.
What God is doing is correcting Israel's secondary emotional response.
Mm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
There are deep primary responses that every human being has. They are culturally expressed based on your learned
like
behaviors.
Fear of clowns.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Fear is a natural response, but like I'm trying to make it work for you is what I'm doing.
Yeah,
like you're making a
it's
joke, but I'm
beautiful.
trying to make it work.
I don't
But,
think it's that big a
but
stretch.
it's-
Sorry,
no,
ignore me
but
and move
but,
on.
But secondary emotions are socially learned. So secondary emotions. So like you might feel, so a secondary emotion, you might feel sexual arousal. That's normal, but like maybe like you might experience, if you live in a prudish culture, you might then experience disgust.
Yeah.
Disgust is a secondary emotion. It's culturally learned.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, you might experience sexual arousal and then not experience disgust where you should.
Yep.
That's also what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You have these secondary emotions. They're cultural. That's what God's working out here in Leviticus when it comes to this like long list of who you do and don't like bang.
I love this breakdown of that. Especially like this whole,
Yeah.
as little as I've read of the
You just
Bible
said
too,
that.
but the breakdown of like, this is what's happening, just the general,
Yeah.
this is what this section is about. This is what this section is about.
Yeah.
And then, the deeper context of, well, this is because of their life in Egypt, and all that. Yeah,
And this
it's
is
great.
this
It's
is
great.
why I'm such a friggin' dork, because I know everybody, like, no one wakes up and goes, I'm just going to read Leviticus.
Yeah.
Literally no
Not
one.
many. Not
And,
many.
and I do that
Yeah.
because I'm a dork. And
I don't think you're a
like,
dork.
but I like this part. This is the part that I like. That is the point of the Holiness Code, is to unlearn 400 years of secondary emotional responses to deep primary emotions.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole goal. Because also remember, Israel was in slavery. They were the dregs. They were treated however Egypt wanted to treat them.
Andy, it goes back to what you remember how I've always said, it's God operating within the good and evil construct that man had made for himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those primary emotions, those things that we have, the effect that came from the fall, now God is teaching us how to respond. Kind of like the way, this is going to be an awful way of saying it, but Freud with the id, ego, and superego, when you break down, your id is the primary, the primal deep
Yeah.
down. And
Yeah.
so then you have your ego, which begins to the secondary emotion, how you respond. That little war that's going on inside your mind before the superego actually does whatever it might do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's
see what
what's
I'm
so
saying?
interesting about babies.
Yeah.
Because babies are
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
cross-cultural because they haven't learned any of
Yeah.
that stuff yet.
Nope.
Babies, infants below the age of like 1, they all respond exactly the same to exactly the same stuff. And that's where you can find the baseline of who we all are before we've culturally learned how to express ourselves, right? Yeah, so that's exactly right. So all these prohibitions, you don't make a law against something that people aren't already doing. You don't.
Yeah.
Laws exist to make illegal things people are doing. Like, for example, did you know that in Wisconsin, it's illegal to serve a butter substitute?
Are you kidding?
No. Did
I
you
love
know?
blue laws.
Yeah. No. That's not a blue law. So, and I'll tell you why. Because also it's illegal to steal kitchen grease in North Carolina.
It's also illegal.
2013. It is illegal
Oh,
to steal
yeah,
kitchen
when
grease.
people-
It's
would
illegal
take
in
it, yeah.
Arizona today to wash a donkey in a bathtub. That's a Burroughs reference. And
Nice.
it's true. It
There's
is
all of them.
true.
That's so
But the
random.
thing is, while you might find opportunity to like yuck about this stuff, when you stop and look at why, Wisconsin put
it's
that
a
book.
response.
Wisconsin
Absolutely.
put on the books in 1895 because Wisconsin was trying to protect its dairy industry. That's why it outlawed margarine.
Sure.
In 2013, restaurant owners went to legislators in North Carolina. Yellow grease is considered a commodity and it can be resold to help offset the cost of running a restaurant. And so kitchen helpers were siphoning off the grease and stealing it and selling it. They were making a profit. So it was in response to a thing that was happening.
Yes.
So that is
Yeah.
what we're talking about. God's not making these laws out of nowhere. God's making these laws in response specifically to cultural practices in Egypt and in Canaan.
Yes. Specifically because it says it. Specifically.
Because it specifically
in
says it.
Leviticus.
Right. So let's not skip the hard stuff. Let's get right into.
Were you about to say something,
Lexodus-
Andy?
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say I'm with Wisconsin. That could go nationwide.
I'm with Arizona. I don't want anybody washing their donkey up in my bathtub.
I'm
You know
sick
what?
of it. I'm sick of it.
Yeah, you know what? You and me, we'll have to fight about that one. It's the only place I'm ever going to wash
Andy
my dog.
always needs to wash his ass in the bath.
That was good.
Yeah.
I love
Yeah,
it.
there you go.
All right, so let's not skip the hard part. Let's lead. So that's what starts Leviticus. Don't do like they do in Egypt. Don't do like they do in Canaan. Then a list of don't sleep with these people, right? You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife. She is his aunt. You know, the nakedness of your father's brother's wife, blah, blah, blah. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is menstruating. You shall not have sexual relations with a kinsman's wife, right? Dudes, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this.
Yeah.
Because Egypt does these things and it disenfranchises women who have no power.
Very good.
Now, this is also really interesting. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her. Then out of nowhere, 1821, you shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord, and you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is a perversion.
So immediately he takes you to the god Moloch and the practices. So whoever is worshiping this god are doing those very things. And one of the things I do know about Moloch is that they took infant children and they burned them alive to Moloch.
History is
Did you know that?
crazy.
That is so triggering.
So I'm so sorry.
No, I mean, it's like, I'm
so sorry. I should have warned you.
No, it's okay. Totally fine. I'm 6 months postpartum and I have an infant. So my baby is what they would be doing that too.
And
Yeah.
that was in honor of their god. So
Yeah.
as soon as he shifts gears into Moloch, which I've never noticed, I'm so glad you read that.
Yeah.
Now I'm starting to think, oh my gosh, these people were doing these things to the worship of another god.
It makes me want to cry. It just makes me want to cry.
Yeah.
Because here comes this God who's like, oh my, stop doing that.
That's
Yeah,
it.
it's wow.
Stop
There's a place
doing
in the
that.
Bible where he says, it never even came to my mind. This is God Almighty saying that.
Yeah. I never even would have occurred to me to ask you to do
did
something like that.
Never.
Except for Abraham, which is a whole other thing to unpack.
Yeah, we're going to be
I
doing
find
this.
it fascinating that Abraham like never talked to Isaac after that. Like you never see them in the same story after
Yeah.
that. I'm like, ooh,
Do you
Isaac.
think it was because of Abraham or do you think it was because of Isaac?
I think Isaac was like, you are nuts.
I'm out.
I'm out.
What happened there?
Abraham was going to
Is there-
sacrifice his own son. Remember
Oh,
Isaac?
yeah,
And then
okay.
after that, suddenly Isaac just doesn't want to talk
But
to
you
his
gotta
dad
think
anymore.
about it. But you got to think about it.
Right.
That's what other nations were doing. This
Right.
is the beginning. That story of Abraham and Isaac, it's the beginning of God saying, okay, do this. I'm going to see if you're willing to do this thing that you're watching your neighbors do to please their
Right.
God. And then right when you're about to do it, that's the moment where I'm like, but now listen carefully. I don't ever want you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But once Abraham was willing to show this God, that Abraham was willing to worship this God to the extent and extreme. Because let me tell you something right now. We talk about child sacrifice. There is not a single mother that didn't watch that happen and weep and wail.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they wanted to do this and this was great because like they
Unless
used to
they
bury
were
children.
mentally ill.
They used to bury children at the quarters of like Aztec temples and stuff. Like we find lots of child sacrifice in lots of different cultures, right? It's a thing because what you're asking to offer, is the thing that's most precious
Yeah.
to you. And so these people are offering their gods the thing that is the most precious, right?
The point
Yeah.
of the choice of the sacrifice is the most
Painful. What's going to suck
That's
the
why
absolute
it's
most.
chosen because it's
Right.
hurting somebody so
Right.
badly.
Yeah,
So before we jump
exactly.
to conclusions about like the nature of these people that are doing this thing, right? Like keep in mind, like these nobody knew. They were desperate to try and figure out how to curry the favor of their quote unquote gods because everybody, including the Israelites, was just living at the whim of like nature.
Yeah.
Like they had no control over floods. They had no control over, locusts. They had no control over their crops. And these people didn't have greenhouses and like hydroponic services. They didn't have like, Skippy peanut butter that has a shelf life of 40,000 years. So when you have a bad crop, you can just go eat something. They didn't have that. They were desperate at all times.
Something you just said, I'm going to agree with what you said earlier about why you love our God because he doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And so he took Abraham where he did. But with those same emotions that you were just showing me
Oh,
about
yeah.
how you felt about your child,
Yeah.
do you think that the God felt the same way about his son?
Oh, stop it.
Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, sometimes when we say, Jesus Christ was sacrificed for our sins, we say it so nonchalant. But how do you think God felt about the loss
I
of his
can't
son?
watch the Easter. I can't watch anything Easter without bawling. My husband was not saved when we first started dating, and his favorite musical is Jesus Christ Superstar.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, "You've never seen Jesus Christ Superstar?" I'm like, "No." So he's like, "But it's about your dude. It's like your guy, right?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Yeah." Dylan was so cute. We started dating. He was 23. He bought me a paint by numbers Jesus he found at the thrift store. And he's like, hey, I found your guy at the store.
Your guy.
He used to call him my guy all the time. It was really cute. so he because I was 36 when we started dating. So I was like, oh.
Yeah, you're so cute.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about the age difference. It makes me angry.
I'm 11 years difference with my wife.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Because people get all weird about it. And like they respond to me like I'm some kind of predator because that's what a cougar is, a predator. I don't like it. Anyway, he's gross. But anyway.
He was a grown man.
He was a grown man. 23. Close,
he's probably thinking,
grown-ish.
Nailed it. He is in his 20s.
Literally was thinking that.
Here's a picture of your guy, paint by numbers.
It was so cute. He was like,
so
here's your
funny.
guy. So we watched Jesus Christ Superstar, which is a musical, people. It's a musical.
Yeah.
I am sobbing, just bawling. Oh, yeah. I can't watch anything about the resurrection. I can't watch anything about the crucifixion. I can't watch anything about like, the road to Golgotha.
Don't watch The Passion of Christ.
Oh, I've seen it. I sobbed the whole time. I cried the whole time, which I also appreciate the anti-Semitic overtones and like the absolute glorification of his suffering in this kind of like theatrical way that was a little. I appreciate the.
Are you being sarcastic?
No. What I'm saying is I can understand the criticisms.
Oh, I see.
That were leveled against the film.
Yeah.
It was gratuitous for no reason. Yeah. It was this, that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
I totally get that. Also, hostile.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like we are gross as a people. And sometimes we have to be like brought to the edges of what we're comfortable with in order to confront ourselves.
Yeah. Are you talking about the movie Hostel?
Yeah. People watch that movie casually. People watch House of a Thousand Corpses casually. They're like, oh, that movie's like, it's just a joke. Like, so why that's okay, but The Passion of Christ is not. I think you're right. It was gratuitous and like ridiculous and like overblown and all that stuff. I get it, right?
Hostel.
Hostel, the movie.
Okay, that. Okay.
Yeah, we're gross.
My brain was,
Our movies are gross.
Never
We do
seen that
gratuitous, nasty shit all the time.
The way that you describe
I cuss
that.
so much. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. John Mulaney. Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
The comedian.
Oh,
yeah.
He was talking about how Bill Maher in Religulous and all the time on his show is always like cracking down on people for believing in Jesus. And John Mulaney, of course, he's very liberal and he's a funny comedian, but he just comes out and he's like, because my mom believes in him, so shut up, you a-hole. Liberal to liberal. He's like, because my mom believes in it, so shut your mouth.
Yeah.
You know? So I was just thinking like what you were just saying just a second ago, like it's generational, but anyway.
So we sidetracked as usual. I hope y'all are following along and taking notes.
I'm sure they're fine.
We get a lot of 5 stars on this kind of stuff, so we're
read
good.
this Leviticus 18:21 talking about Moloch, and then follows that exact verse with, and you shall not lie with a man as a woman. It is an abomination. It is a toveya. Mm-hmm. It is culturally not what I want you to do. So that suggests now 2 things. Number 1, that verse is not followed with, and women shall not lie with women as women lie with men. Mm-hmm. So it's not the homosexual.
Sounds like it's describing a worship type thing.
Yeah.
Right?
So, and also it says, fellatio's cool. That's fine.
Yeah. It doesn't say anything about it.
It doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say anything about loving inner, personal consensual relationship. And again, it's the absence of the same prohibition for women that leads me to believe, just like the previous 13 relations described, it's not about what he doesn't want people to do. It's a commentary on these specific practices that were being exercised in Canaan and in Egypt. So, just for shits, let's go to prostitution in Wikipedia.
Okay.
The history of prostitution, Wikipedia. The ancient Near East was home to many shrines, temples, or houses of heaven, which were dedicated to various deities. These shrines and temples were documented by the Greek historian Herodotus in the Histories, where sacred prostitution was a common practice. Sumerian records dating back to circa 24,000 BCE are the earliest recorded mention of prostitution as an occupation.
Did you say 24,000?
Yeah, 2,400. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, holy crap.
You know what? I get my right and my left mixed up all the time too. There was not an extra zero. 2,400 BCE. Yeah, so approximately 1,000 years prior to this law that we're writing.
Yeah,
right?
the Sumerians. Yeah,
That's the earliest. We just discussed how what was going on in Cleopatra was 500-600 years after this time period, and they were still doing the same thing.
Yeah, it was around the turn of the century.
Yeah, so
or that time.
Dating back to 2400 BCE are the earliest recorded
Millennium.
mention of prostitution as an occupation. These describe a temple brothel operated by Sumerian priests in the city of Uruk. This kakum, or temple, was dedicated to the goddess Ishtar and was home to 3 classes of women. The first class of women was only permitted to perform sexual rituals in the temple. The second class had access to the grounds and catered to the visitors, and the third to the lowest classes living on the temple grounds. The third was also free to find customers on the street. In the region of Canaan, where the Lord was about to take them, a significant portion of temple prostitutes were male. Male prostitution was also widely practiced in Sardinia and in some of the Phoenician cultures, usually in honor of the goddess Ishtar. Presumably, under the influence of the Phoenicians, this practice was developed in other ports of the Mediterranean Sea. This is what Leviticus 18:22 is talking about, and it is why it is preceded by the prohibition against child sacrifice as a form of worship, and why God explains these practices are what is leading to the inhabitants of those lands being expelled in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
It's why Torah is the only place we see what is ethical and what is holy in the same place, and it is why God gets so angry when his people break his covenants. This is, again, not about the loving, committed relationship between two people. If it was, then 1823 would say, and women should not lie with women as women lie with men. It does not. What God is talking about is a form of idolatry, the rites and rituals practiced as these people worshiped their gods. That is what the Israelites are not to engage in while they are worshiping Hashem. Mm-hmm. That's the point. And I'm going to tell you something right now. Rick, can we go back to Exodus?
Sure.
And can we please read Exodus 32, 1-6?
Sure.
Because we brought this up in a previous episode.
Sure.
And
you
so
want me to read it?
I want you to read it
Give me a
because
moment.
you brought this up at our last episode.
I did.
Yeah.
I don't even know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, when we did the little chit-chatty episode with me and you and Big Daddy Carter.
Oh, okay. Exodus chapter 32, verses what?
1-6.
All right. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Do I need to read it in a specific version? I'm in ASB.
If you could read it in like a fake Italian accent.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding.
Now, when are the people? All right. So now I remember this now. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. For this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him." Aaron said to them, "Tear off the gold rings from which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then he took the gold from their hands and fashioned it with an engraving tool and made it into a cast metal calf. And they said, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So the next day they got up early and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and got up to engage in lewd behavior.
Verse 6, according to my study Bible and based on other several interpretations, is a deeply sexual overtone. Lewdness is some deeply sexual overtones. They were worshiping their God with sex. And Hashem is pissed.
Yes.
Moses comes down and God is like, go get your boy. God's up on the Moses Mount. He's like, I'm going to go off. Go down and get your boy. And that's when Moses goes down because God's like, they're doing it.
They're doing what I've told.
They're doing the thing. He hadn't told him yet.
He hadn't told him yet.
But that's the idea. So we're talking.
So he's talking through Moses prior to even.
He's talking to Moses. He's talking to Moses. They're down there engaging in these sexual rites of sexual worship as if God is some kind of voyeur, and that's how you worship God is by doing it in front of him.
We almost act like we wouldn't be like the Egyptians would be, but we so would be.
Well, of course we would be.
I mean, modern cults.
If that's your culture, then
modern
you do what your culture tells you to do.
Yeah, like this guy brought us out. Here we are. He's gone. We haven't seen him for days. What's going on? Let's get back to what we know.
We're going to get back to what we know.
And we're going to be calling on the God that we used to call on before our lives were okay back then.
Yeah.
Well, it's just familiarity.
It wasn't so bad.
So many times we look at them like they were so dumb, but really they were just doing what they knew.
They were doing what was familiar. That's the whole point of Leviticus. The whole point is erasing 400 years of secondary emotional response learned culturally. That is what Tovea is. That is what it is, an abomination.
Yep.
That is what God is saying in Leviticus 18:22. A man lies with a man as a man lies with a woman. He's talking about worshiping by sleeping with temple prostitutes. In Deuteronomy, God also has to specifically tell them, nobody give your daughter as a temple prostitute and don't give your son as a temple prostitute. The word is Kadesh, Kadesha. We talked about that.
Yeah.
God,
That's right.
in Deuteronomy, God specifically says, don't give your children as temple prostitutes. And he has to specify both your daughter and your son. This was,
So, yeah, therefore.
that's what they're talking about. That's
Yeah.
what God's talking about. And the reason God has to throw that in there in Leviticus, which happened when? The second month of the first month of the second year, in chapter 40, that is when the temple is built. This happens in chapter 32.
Yeah.
So immediately following them engaging in lewd behavior with each other, which probably include men sleeping with men as a form to worshiping Ishtar, which we just Wikipedia told us is what they did.
Right.
God's like, "Ugh, now I have to tell you not to do that.
Yeah.
He wasn't telling them not to be in loving, consensual, loving relationships with men. He was telling them, don't engage in this form of worship that includes having sex with men as a way to worship me, because that also is that's not loving. It's using one another's bodies as a sacrifice in a way that God's like,
I hear a slogan developing.
Yeah.
Like, what happens in Egypt stays in Egypt.
There you go. Yeah.
apparently what happens in Egypt didn't stay in Egypt, and that's the whole
but
problem.
It's supposed to.
Yeah. So that's it. That's my whole thing. And, Leviticus 20:13 has the identical language, including prefacing, don't put your children in the fire and don't have sex with men as men have sex with them, because this is an abomination. It's the exact same language because it's the exact same thing. Chapter 20 is just like a quick recap.
Yeah.
It's got like, it's like a shortened version of chapter 18. It's like a recap of all the things I already just said.
And
so we can
again-
do this whole podcast again for chapter 20, but I don't think we need to.
No, and I think you nailed it. And something that I've been begging for, and I don't know that it could ever happen, is that when the scriptures were translated, we talked about those with Dr. Frost about how specific cultural things that should have been included in the language, they couldn't because they were doing a word for word translation instead of knowing what was going on in the time so that we could actually understand what's being stated. Because can you imagine how it would change our culture if we actually all knew a lot of this?
Well, word for word is difficult. Otherwise, I think they'd do it. But
Yeah,
word for word, I think, becomes quite tricky.
It does, but I feel like they're missing it.
Some words illustrate concepts that don't parse nicely.
Yeah.
In definitely not one, but even in a small amount of words. Some cultures have single words that are concepts that in English, and I'm sure it's true the other way too, that in English, literally you require a paragraph to get the fullness of the concept of that one word across. I just think it's hard.
Yeah.
Well, and I was reading somebody talking about the other day. They're studying like an indigenous language in Mexico. It's like the Atowi people or something, and their word for brother is a verb. He brothers me, and their word for we are brothers is reflexive. We brother each other, and their word for brother is a homonym for the verb to walk. And so the word for brother in this language is literally we walk together, or he walks with me.
Wow.
What you're talking about too, when you talk about language, is cultural understandings that you cannot just translate word for word.
That's what I mean.
It's like,
I wish that we could have a Bible that had the cultural translation built within it.
it's impossible. It's too big.
Well, because what you require there is also a small.
But that's why we do this.
A
And that is
divergence
why we
into a
do this,
history
and I
lesson.
love it. It gives
That's
us
exactly
purpose
right.
to do that. You're exactly right.
Yeah, because it would take a divergence into a history lesson, even to literally to do the best job, I
see all of pain and I see all the stuff that people go through in life. I see like the
Yeah.
doctrine of hell and the way that it is used and how that word was inserted into the text.
Yeah.
And instead of it being Gehenna or Hades or whatever it might be, and how entire theological systems are built upon it, and how people flee in terror, or they don't go to church because they don't want to hear about their family who have already passed on burning alive forever. They
Yeah.
don't want to hear that. And I get it. Like, I totally get it. And so you think to yourself, there's 63 times that this word is used in the Bible and it is incorrectly translated
Every single time.
Every time.
That's why I'm clear about the fact that pornography is not in the Bible. There is not a single verse about watching porn.
Mm-hmm.
You have to figure out how to take the message, the general overall message of how to live your life properly, and transpose it into our modern culture. We have to extrapolate because it's not there. The word homosexual does not exist in the Bible.
Right.
It doesn't exist. So we just as much as we cannot say the Bible tells us not to look at porn, the Bible doesn't actually tell you not to look at porn. The Bible also never tells you not to be gay. Never once. What it specifically says is, when you look at a woman and you have sex with her in your mind, you've already committed adultery. We can extrapolate from those kinds of verses. It's probably not good to objectify each other through pornography. So we can extrapolate that. We can extrapolate from this verse that it is absolutely unacceptable to go have sex with someone who you are not in a relationship with and who you don't love in church in order to worship God.
Yeah.
We can absolutely extrapolate that. We cannot extrapolate that any and all consensual homosexual relationships based on this verse are an abomination. We cannot extrapolate that. We can't. I'm sorry.
Would you consider lust a primary or secondary emotion?
I think sexual arousal is a primary because every being experiences sexual arousal. But I think that I think you would have to be critical of the word lust.
Well, the reason I ask that is because in relation to what you just said about Jesus, like if you look at a woman and you have lust for her in the heart, you've already committed adultery. And, we know God's dealing with the secondary emotions. But in that instance, I think Jesus is getting to the heart of the matter, which is you are
reducing that being to a sexual object for the sake of your pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And because you've done it mentally, you're just as guilty as if you would have done the act.
Yeah. Just for my own sake, there was one time in my life during when I was a young Christian. I was like in high school, and there was a situation where a same age person of mine experienced in their church a certain sort of conviction for a certain behavior, and they felt the need to come to me and apologize for their mental life.
Oh no! Telling you
regarding
what they thought.
Tears in his eyes, sobbing that basically like I'd been admitted to the spank bank.
Oh no!
And I cannot describe to you how disgusting that made me feel.
Mortified.
Now, this man, he was same age, right? So it wasn't like an adult, right? It was a teenager.
I need you to understand that I laughed because you said spank bank, not because of what it is. Okay.
Well, and the thing is, I want to acknowledge this man's heart. Yeah. Because he was experiencing a deep conviction. He was experiencing the guilt and the shame of having taken a human being and reduced them to a sexual object.
Objectified you, yeah.
And as a female, we talk a lot about the objectification of women because when we don't like that,
right.
Women don't often enjoy that, As Eliza Schlesinger says, unless you're cute, then it's fine. Like, right? Like, she talks about, like, getting catcalled. She says it's like being shot with a penis gun. You're like, ew, right? The point is, we often recognize that as a uniquely female experience because women tend to be the object of these, like, this lustful gaze in this way that removes from a woman her agency and her identity as a person. I listened to a really interesting This American Life episode one time about a trans man who describes what it was like going through puberty and accessing sexuality as a woman, and then what it was like for him when he started taking testosterone and how he accessed sex and sexuality as a man. Now, when you are on T generally you are given like a Herculean dose of tea because you're meant, the amount you would have gotten normally in puberty is like doubled because you have to undo puberty of an estrogen-based puberty and then redo a puberty based on testosterone. So it's a really interesting perspective that this human being offered. And he was like, when I was a woman, I'd be on the subway and I'd be attracted to a woman. And like the thought process always involved like approaching her with like, you know, what book are you reading? And like, maybe we'd go to dinner and have a glass of wine. Like there was always this, who is this person that I'm interested in?
Yeah.
And then when he started getting shots of testosterone, he said it was just like straight pornography. Like it was just like all he would need would be like an ankle showing. And it was just like, I want to have sex with it.
I'm going to plant my seed in you.
Yeah.
Funny.
Yeah, and he said the difference was absolutely astronomical. And so, like, I'm not here to, like, gender lines it and say only men objectify women and, like, that's where – it's just that because the nature of the hormones, testosterone and estrogen are fundamentally different, that's just one of the areas of point of contention that I tend to have with people that are trying to advocate for the gender spectrum, because I definitely am an advocate. Gender is a spectrum, but like estrogen and testosterone are fundamentally different hormones. And when a body has a preponderance of one versus preponderance of the other, they behave differently, especially in puberty.
Yeah, sure.
So it just tends to be that this law is directed towards that. And as the embodiment of the type of person, like I have ex-boyfriends that like whenever I'm around him, I'm like, please don't look at me.
Yeah.
Because like I know you've seen it now and I know you think about it. And not all ex-boyfriends, some ex-boyfriends are super chill. But the ones that I know don't have a problem objectifying women, the ones that did it when I was dating them, now I don't even like being around them. And I'm like, I'm angry that I ever gave somebody access to my body. Knowing that now this person, even though I've told them, like, I really don't want you to think about me, knowing that this person would willfully think about me in a sexual fashion for the sake of his own sexual gratification, even though I've expressly asked him, like, told him that's gross, don't do that to me.
And dudes in
my
a locker
agency
room
is removed.
Dudes in a locker room will high five each other because they've tapped that.
Right.
So it's like there's the totally different thing
Yeah.
between the male and the female in this regard.
Yeah.
I totally see that. Yeah.
And that's the
It's not
unfortunate
all men,
reality of it. It's not all men.
That's
It's not all men.
women.
But when your body has a preponderance of testosterone versus a preponderance of estrogen, you have a different level of challenge.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily your fault. You know, it just is. And so this is why, like, but women can't help men. Men have to help man really with this stuff. You know,
to be clear, we're making a specific example of this one factor.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not the only factor.
It's definitely not
But
the
I'm
only
just
factor.
saying
And
that
I
out
didn't.
loud.
Yeah, and I was saying it just in regard to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Because I know, like, I've had friends in the past that made me very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because they would say things like that about women. And I don't objectify women, and that's just because I don't know why. I don't.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's just not my makeup, you know.
Yeah.
But whenever I was around people that would act that way, I was always like,
it's gross.
yeah, it's like
Yeah, it's
I was very
gross. I
uncomfortable
agree.
with it, you know. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, folks, that brings our study on Exodus.
Or Leviticus.
Or excuse me, I don't have an excuse. Leviticus 18:22. That brings us our study on Leviticus 18:22 and Exodus 20:13 to a close. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Please email us with your thoughts, feelings, and emotions.
info@burrowsofberea.com, or you can go to our Burrows of Berea Facebook page where we put out funny pictures of donkeys every day and talk about it. And then
I'm gonna give Rick pictures of my cat.
Yeah.
We'll put that on Patreon.
Yeah, give us your thoughts and your feedback and let us know how you feel. And we will see you all next time where we will continue this discussion on Burrows of Berea, Notes from the Underground.
Peace out. Hey guys, this is Rick from the Burrows of Berea. Do you know how much blood, sweat, and tears it takes to make a podcast? None. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't cost a lot. And so if you guys don't mind, if anybody would like to give to help us with these episodes, it would be great. We'll put out even more content. And if you go to our Patreon page, just search for the Burrows of Berea, you'll get extra notes, extra episodes, and it's pretty much free. $1 gets you a lot. Thanks, guys.
I got a new website though.
You do.
It looks real slick.
Nice.
Yeah, and I've got like testimonials
talking
from
about for your
companies that I've
blog?
worked with and stuff. Yeah, like
Oh, no.
adios to the blog. I
Okay.
nixed the blog. I still have it, but I took away the monetary. I took away the Wix, like, domain hosting and all that other stuff, and I gave it. I have a new website, subverseconsulting.com.
I love it.
It's really nice. Yeah, it looks really good too. I'm really happy with how it came out. So,
Nice.
yeah.
By the way, I'm
Nice.
digging your Sasquatch shirt. I totally dig it.
Do you know who that is?
Yeah, he's like
Sasquatch?
he's a local guy.
Yeah, he's a local guy, Dean. Like,
I didn't even know it was a
Sasquatch.
thing. I just like the image of the Sasquatch with the sax.
So do you know who's the Marcus? Oh, this will be a fun plug in the post podcast jibber jabber.
Yeah, Marcus King.
The Marcus King band used to have a saxophone player named Dean Mitchell, and Dean started an Instagram and I don't know if it was a TikTok too. He started Instagram where he would take this giant like Sasquatch costume with him when they were on tour,
Out into the woods.
and he would take a few minutes and like go out into the woods and like put on his saxophone or put on his Sasquatch outfit and play saxophone. So he became the Saxquatch. Well, it ended up being like all these followers and people got like super into it. So he ended up being able to like leave the Marcus King band
Yeah, because
his Saxquatch side gig was such an important, and now he can just
and
go
road
on tour.
road touring
Yeah.
is nightmare. So he just decided he didn't want to do it as much.
Do you know Dean?
No.
I went to school with Dean.
Oh, no
So
kidding.
Dean's my buddy. Dean gave us, me and Dylan, he have
Oh,
these
no
shirts.
kidding.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's
Dean
awesome.
gave us these shirts. I used to cut his hair for years because we were in college together. And so I'm like, do you know Dean? Because it was. Touring was a nightmare. It's really hard. And he has a kid now. He's got a beautiful little boy.
Oh.
And so, who's just a little bit younger than Aurora. And so I think that he wanted, some more flexibility and stuff. But it's like, it turns out that touring with the Saxquatch, because he writes all the music himself,
Yeah.
and I think he was in a video game. He's been on Jimmy Fallon. Like,
Wow.
go Google it, everyone. Saxquatch.
Yeah.
And so he gave us
Sax,
this.
yeah.
This is like one of the original shirts that he gave me.
That is
That's
so
so
neat.
cool. I didn't know
like
you
it.
knew him.
I mean, it's like
Yeah.
he's walking through the woods, and it's just a silhouette of the Sasquatch with a sax.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Like
Yeah.
he does really cool
and he's
stuff.
obviously he's a very good sax player
He's
as
incredible.
well. Yeah, he's a really good sax.
That's, like,
I
part
guess
of the
he
deal.
toured with Marcus King, but
Yeah.
but running into the woods with a costume doesn't make you a good sax player. It could have been comedy. Just
Yeah, that's-
you know what I mean.
That actually sounds that would be something that would go viral on TikTok, to be
Yeah.
honest with you.
And I can't remember. It's like I'm sitting here trying to like sort through the timeline of my relationship with Dean, and I don't remember when this all started.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he would know. But yeah, it's a really funny little thing.
Have you guys seen
nice
the
guy
TikTok?
too? Wonderful
Is he?
human
That's
being.
great.
Like one of those people that like when they get really a lot of success, you're just like, fuck yeah,
Yeah.
That's
you
so
deserve
good for
it.
you.
You're just a
Yeah.
lovely guy. Yeah.
Did have you guys ever seen the TikTok with the Batman TikToks where he's like he walks up, somebody throws something on the ground and he grabs it and he's like, litter bug, and then he starts beating the crap out of it.
Oh no.
Like, and he's not hitting the person, but it's just like hitting the screen. Have you seen that? Like, it went totally viral and like millions of views. And that there's a kid that went to school with my son. I remember him. He came up playing baseball with him, and he's done really well for himself
really?
on TikTok. Yeah,
Isn't that wild?
yeah.
There's a lot of people like
I think, though, I will say, I think it's like you get famous on TikTok, but if you can move to like any other platform, you get way more money. Like
Oh,
TikTok
sure.
apparently doesn't pay squat compared to the others.
Brother,
Like,
Yeah.
I'm telling you
It's, like,
right now,
abusive.
you Google Saxquatch, he's got 138,000 followers on Instagram. Like,
really
just
good.
Google it. He's
Yeah.
like, you can buy tickets for his 2023-2024 tour. Like,
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a great guy. But anywho,
anyhow,
yeah, anywho's back to what we
Anywhere?
was up to. Yeah,
Yeah.
I always,
What
I
way?
said C to the guy this morning. I was ordering some Starbucks on the way over here because like I never do that, but like someone gave me a $10 gift card for Mother's Day, so I was like, ooh, sweet. So I got myself a little coffee and a sandwich, and like the guy was like, is that all? And I was like, C, and he was like, what? And I
So he wasn't Latin, obviously.
yeah, I say stuff all the time that I think makes sense. Like I've said "danka" to people, and they're just like, "What?" I'm like, "Is it okay?"
I
all
don't
right."
know
All right.
any other languages, but C and Dunka, it feels like,
I feel like if you know the word avocado, like you ought to know the word "C." Like,
yeah.
like if you in any way, shape, or form have ever in the history of your life celebrated Cinco de Mayo, you better know the word "C."
Yes, exactly.
But anywho, we ready to roll, Andy?